All right, Carlette, just let me know when you need me to move you ahead.
Excellent. Well, thanks everyone for hanging in there. As I mentioned, this is a packed day, and so we know we're giving you a lot of information. Good news is we are recording this, and all of these presentation slides will be available afterwards to refresh your memory. So we're going to move on now to some reminders, some administrative budget and reporting reminders. For those of you who have been with your projects for a while, you've seen some iteration of this presentation the last couple of years. So it is not the exact same because we know you've seen it before. Those of you who are new, we hope this information is helpful to you. If you're lost or you need some more detailed information, just reach out and we can certainly schedule a time to talk, and I can share previous slides from this same presentation. So this is really just going to be kind of an overview and some reminders. Next slide. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the administrative reminders. Primarily just a reminder about the administrative actions, your key personnel, regulatory policy references, record keeping and audits. Then we'll move to just some reminders about the budget, particularly fiscal management and carryover. And hopefully spend the bulk of the time on the third reminder for this presentation, which is reporting. You've all submitted reports at this point several times, but we are still having some reports that come in with a little bit of information that's skewed or not quite presented correctly. So we wanted to make sure we spent some time on reminding you about reporting. Next slide. So just a quick reminder about administrative actions. So administrative actions are essentially any actions that we need to make changes in G5 or your grant file. And so any changes, it is very, very important to let us know about those, particularly key personnel. Next slide. And we'll go over these individually. So the administrative reminders, as I mentioned, these are things that are essentially need to be approved. And in some cases, it's not so much an approval, but it's at least we need to know. So your ed program officer needs to know if you have any of these changes. And some do require some conversations if they're complex. If they're very simple changes, you will find that it's not as difficult to do, but some things to keep in mind would be any kind of changes to your terms and conditions of the grant, which we see very little of at this point. Any cost requirements that require approval in accordance with the uniform guidance. If you are transferring from one grant entity to another, again, that's an area we see very little of, but it does happen for various reasons. If your project director is going to be absent for more than 3 months, please let us know, because we'd actually like to make a full change in the system. You all are aware that a lot of correspondence goes out via G5. And so if there's going to be an absence of the project director for a significant amount of time, we need to make sure that we have the right person in the system. And this happens. People go on maternity leave, people take breaks, people are reassigned. And I will say that this group, for the most part, has been really, really good at keeping us informed when there's a project director is going to be out or you're changing for some reason. And the next bullet is very similar. If there's a reduction of at least 25% in the project director's time, we do need to know that, because that's a system change that we have to note in G5. If you are transferring a substantive amount of work to a third party, this typically doesn't happen at the LEA level. We see this a little bit more sometimes at the SEA level, but nonetheless, if that is happening, we definitely need to know. And of course, any changes in key personnel. And just a reminder, when we say key personnel, we are actually referring to the project director and the authorized representative, and then any other person that's paid through the grant with a significant role. Next slide. Okay. As it relates to key personnel, some of you have had changes in your project director, and you may have other changes, and that's fine with us. We just need to know. We will ask for an official request by way of an email, letter that's signed by the authorized representative, or if it's an authorized representative change, then we'll need to get something on agency letterhead with some information. Keep in mind that what you see on the screen are the roles, the primary roles of each of those persons. So if you are considering or needing to make a change with either your PD or your AR, you want to consider what the roles are. We've had a couple of situations where people have asked to change and they provide a new PD, but then there's another person doing pretty much all of the bullets you see listed under the project director. So keep in mind kind of what those roles are, to make the most informed choices on your end, who should be the primary contact in each of those areas. Next slide. In terms of some regulatory and policy references, there are times when you will just want to reference grant-related policy and guidelines and that govern your grant. And so these are some that you should be familiar with and have an understanding of how to access. So the first is your grant award notification. If you are the project director, you can access that. Any written guidance provided by the program officer. Of course, the governing legislation for this program. EDGAR, which is the administration regulations for the Department of Education, the uniform guidance, and of course, your grant announcement, application package, and your application. And we put these here because oftentimes when there are changes and new project directors come on board, they have some very basic questions that could probably be answered through something as simple as the original application. And sometimes we find that they may not have that, which happens. You know, people leave abruptly, or they leave and maybe things are locked away and a new person comes on board and doesn't have them. But these are things that you should definitely be familiar with and know how to access, not just for your own understanding, but you'll find that if you're ever in a situation where you're audited, most of these things come in handy because you will need to reference them. And of course, you can always reach out to your federal project officer for information. But just as an aside, I would think that these are things that you kind of need to keep in your folder, your grant folder, and have with you at all times. Next slide. Main reminders about record keeping. And again, we don't monitor your record keeping so much, but we do want to make sure that you understand there is a requirement to keep good records. And you know, you of course do that anyway, I'm sure, with your other programs and just your work in general. But you want to make sure you are especially doing so for these grants because most of you, probably all of you, fall into the category of the single program audit situation. So if your agency receives $750,000 or more in federal funds, you're required to have an audit. And if things come up related to your audit, you would want to have certain things in place. So this, again, is just a reminder. Also a reminder that once the grant is over, you are expected to keep your grant files and your records up to 3 years after you close out. Now, the exception, of course, is if you're in the middle of an audit or there's some type of litigation going on, you may be asked to keep them longer, but a minimum of 3 years. So just a reminder. Next slide. And again, audits, as I mentioned, there are really kind of two types of audits that you'll see most often with this grant, which is the one that I mentioned that you will have if your agency expends $750,000 or more annually in federal funds. And those audits do go into a federal audit clearinghouse. And we actually pull those audits when you submit your annual performance report, and we are processing what we need to process in order to recommend you for your next year funding. So even though we don't talk a lot about that and what it involves, those do pop up, and we do access those. And then there's the OIG audit, which none of you have been subject to. Those are typically not good audits because they are a result of some type of complaint or serious audit finding. So we hope you're not in that situation, but it's good to be aware that that is another type of audit that you would potentially see, but not you, other grantees, not you guys. You guys are great. Next slide. And again, this is just kind of a reminder of things that you want to have with you in the event that you have to respond to specific audit questions or conversations. And all of these things are referenced in the record keeping slide. Next slide. Common audit findings. You can kind of read those at your leisure, but these things do appear in those audit reports, and we do note them if they are on your audit report as a part of our processing for consideration for future funding. Next slide. All right. Budget reminders. And if you have questions, do put them in the chat. We will hopefully have time to get to them, because I'm going to go pretty quickly through these as they are just reminders. So we have the fiscal management and the carryover. Next slide. So fiscal management, we always put this slide in here, not so much because grantees are not doing a good job of managing the funds, but just again, as a reminder. And typically it's because the project director is often not the person in your agency who is responsible for going in G5 and drawing down funds and reconciling the money. And we understand that, and that's fine with us because you have, specific duties. But as the project director, you are still responsible for understanding and having oversight of that. So if there's a question about your budget, if there's a question about spending, I'm not going to call your budget analyst. I'm not going to call your finance office. I'm going to call the project director. So it just makes sense that you build a relationship with whoever in your office manages that. There have been times where we've reached out to project directors and they don't know how much money they have. They don't know what's left in the account. They don't know, if they are overspent or underspent. They don't know what's been paid out. And while that's not specifically your job, likely, it is your responsibility as a project director to have knowledge of. Okay. So again, just a reminder, understand your accounting system. It doesn't mean that you have to take on a second job and perform the work and the duties of the people in your finance office, but you need to have a basic understanding. And of course, if there are things that are more specific and you just don't know the answer, you can find out and let us know. But again, your federal project officer is going to call the project director because you're our first line of contact for this grant. Next slide. Quick reminder about contracts and consultants. It's not really a big deal for you guys now just because of where you are in your grant, but some folks are adding new contracts and consultants. Please, please, please make sure you are following your state and local procurement process when awarding these contracts. We say that at the application stage, we say that at the new grantee meeting, and we say that again in these meetings, because that is key. That is key that you are doing that in a manner that is consistent with your procurement process, because what we do not want is for any situation to occur where folks are having to pay back money because they didn't do the process the correct way. So we just always like to remind folks of the contracting and consultant requirements for this grant and following procurement processes. Internal controls, of course, you want to make sure you have appropriately managed the funds and you have a means of controlling that and checking that and being aware of that. Next slide.
Hey, Carlette, this is Brian. I'm just doing a quick time check here. We have about 8 minutes left, and I
Oh.
think we need about 5 of those for Jen for some of those updates as well.
So we're going to go very quickly. Next slide. Returning money, you can read this a little bit later on your own. I don't think any of you all are at the point where you need to return any money, but note this slide if you do. Next slide. I won't spend a lot of time on types of payment reimbursement. I think we only have 2 grantees on reimbursement, but know that that is something that could happen if there are some mismanagements or questions with money or the administration of this grant. Next slide. Indirect cost rates. The only thing I'll say about the indirect cost rate is to make sure you have the recent indirect cost rate agreement. You do need to report that with every report if you are if you have an indirect cost rate, and do reference the slide so that when you're calculating your budget, you do so correctly. Next slide. Carryover. I do want to reference this slide and have you to pin it or note it. Carryover is any money that you are moving forward to the next budget period for allowable costs because you didn't use it. Carryover is allowed, it is not guaranteed. I do want to emphasize that when we talk, and we'll have a specific webinar about the IPRs, but please note that you need to anticipate your carryover and discuss that in the IPR, because that is the time we start reviewing when and how much, if carryovers will be allowed. Next slide. All right. I think we can go to the next slide. Really quickly, your IPR will be due May 15th. Yes, we will have a webinar about it, but it will be due May 15th. Next slide. And I think Jen's going to take over.
All right, I'm going to take us into break with the most exciting topic in the world, our annual report and GPRA measures. Mostly, I'm going to point you to a couple of existing resources and highlight a couple of key areas where we want to kind of tighten things up. But overall, the annual reports were really well done this year, and we were able to accurately report and pull information from almost every single LEA, which is fantastic. Most of the LEAs where we weren't able to, it was due to COVID disruptions, which is obviously outside of your control anyway. So thank you for your work on those. It was really helpful. So I really appreciate that. If you need measure by measure guidance, we've done a couple of webinars on this topic. And there's also a document available in the materials folder that walks you through measure by measure how to fill out the form. So just take a look at that. Let me know if you have questions, but it really does kind of hold your hand through the whole process. So take a look at that document for specific guidance. For a couple of key areas where we want to tighten things up, I actually can't see the top of this slide. But when you're filling this out, make sure that you report your GPRA measures and your project measures separately, and use the actual, like, copy and paste the GPRA language so that I know exactly what it is you're reporting. Sometimes there's small changes in the language, and I worry then that I'm not sort of reporting the same numbers across sites. So please just copy and paste that language, and you can keep your project measures separate from that. For each project year, just clearly label a new row. So you can have year 1, year 2, year 3, exactly like it's shown in there. For measures 2 through 4, this is probably the most frequent error. We're counting the number of schools implementing or number of schools improved. So some of you give me counts of discipline reports or counts of schools at Fidelity. But what I need is really just the number and percent of schools implementing or improved, not the number of office discipline referrals that happened in your LEA that year, even though it feels like that's what you should put in there. So just read that GPRA measure really carefully. Remember that a school is considered implementing MTSS with Fidelity if they hit at least tier 1 to criterion on whatever measure that you're using. And then GPRA's measures 5 and 6 are closely related. One is about alcohol and one is about drug use. I do need those separately. So I know that's really difficult in some LEAs because your system doesn't count them differently, but really do need those to be separate, separate measures. So please just separate those out when you do that reporting. With respect to schools implementing opioid prevention strategies, this is a resource. You don't have to use this, but it is something that may be helpful to you to help quantify whether or not a school really has embedded their opioid prevention efforts within their MTSS. So you can take a look at this. It's available in the materials folder for this meeting, but it walks through sort of what it would look like if a district has fully embedded their opioid prevention efforts within their MTSS. And we'll take a minute and do our best to answer questions for you with respect to your reporting. That said, feel free to reach out to your TA provider or to me directly if you have additional questions, because I know that was lightning fast. But we're here to help support your reporting. And I'll just emphasize that the IPR formatting is exactly the same as the APR. Just let us know if for some reason you don't have that data yet because you haven't collected it so far in your school year or whatever. Just make that note so that we know why the data is missing.
Someone did ask, someone mentioned May 15th being on a Sunday. Yes, it is on a Sunday. And remember, the IPRs are emailed, so you will need to email them. And FYI, I'm not going to check my email Sunday. So technically you have to Monday morning because I won't know. Someone asked, will the questions in section C be the same? I'm not sure. As you heard Elise this morning talk about her topic, she did so because that is one of the priority areas of the department. And so there may be some questions in that section about that relate to the priorities, but it won't be an extra collection for you. It just may be, are you doing anything in this area? So it may be. And yes, we'll have a separate webinar about the IPRs and what the reporting date is and what the time period is. But it'll be through, someone asked, through April 30th. Yes, you'll be reporting through April 30th. No, we don't have a date yet for the IPR webinar, but as soon as we do, I'll send it out.
Jen, can I ask a question about GPRA 5 and 6?
Sure.
So, the last 2 school years have been interrupted and our numbers have obviously declined because we, didn't have students on our campuses. And if numbers look very different this year compared to maybe, pre-pandemic years, is there going to be like any kind of consequence or?
No,
okay.
no, and some different LEAs are at different time points. For some people that hit last year where all of a sudden you had kids back on campus. You can't obviously suspend a kid who's not there. So most of you looked really good for a little while. We know that's happening. And that's part of when we submit this data to OSSS and it goes up through the ranks, it goes with a little explanation of sort of why we think what we're seeing is happening. And that's part of it is just, as kids return to campus, we expect that those numbers probably will go up and you would have fewer schools reporting improvement. And then, hopefully that stabilizes once you get back on campus.